such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for sticking through a long morning session. Let me begin with a word of thanks to the session organizers and fellow panelists. I know I speak for Gyempo, as well as myself, how grateful we are to have the opportunity to share our ongoing work with you today. So I will talk about 15 to 20 minutes to provide some background, and then Gyempo will take it from there, and we will do our best to answer any questions together about the painting that you see covered at present. So my name is David Hecht. I'm a PhD candidate in integrative conservation and anthropology at the University of Georgia. So the integrative part of this program recognizes that in order to approach the complexities and challenges of environmental conservation at local and global scales, we benefit from adopting an interdisciplinary lens that counters forces of siloization in the sciences. And more than that, we work to weave together different knowledge traditions and perspectives to understand the multidimensionality of the environmental and social challenges that we face today. So as a cultural and environmental anthropologist in training in this field, I endeavor to foreground and recenter frequently marginalized knowledges and local perspectives in conservation decision-making and practice, and to the best of my abilities, ensure long-term collaboration and participation lie at the core of those endeavors. So today I just hope to discuss one dimension of that multifaceted work, specifically how lived religious practices at the intersections of Vajrayana Buddhism and indigenous Bonche shape and are shaped by Bhutan's biocultural geographies. Additionally, I wish to provide an example of how non-Western landscape ontologies, spatialities, and territorialities can be centered and contributive to more inclusive and representative ways of thinking about environmental protection and conservation in our modern world. Before I continue, let me extend my gratitude for my research collaborators, particularly Jigme Tshering, Indra Acharya, and of course, Gyempo Wangchuk, who's a traditional contemporary artist and truly a humble genius. Let me also thank my institutional collaborators and the funding agencies that supported and are supporting this work, namely the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature, the Bhutan Foundation, and the Firebird Foundation for Anthropological Research. So I began my work with the Royal Society for Protection of Nature in 2014 through the International Crane Foundation, which is an organization that works to conserve and protect all 15 species of cranes around the world. The black-necked crane, or Chung Chung Karmo, known well here in Bhutan and Tibet. And when I started my graduate studies in 2015, we were very intentional and dedicated to sort of co-designing research that aligned with RSPN's long-term community-based conservation initiatives for cranes across the high-altitude wetland communities of Wangyel, Bumtang, Lunsi, and Tashiangsi that you see here. The goal of our research was to collaborate with community partners in Bhutan's conservation protected areas to better understand and map local perceptions of the shared landscapes that are focal arenas for long-term conservation initiatives and NGO-informed environmental governance. Our aim was to better understand how local communities who partner with conservation practitioners perceive and manage their own local environments and to map those shared knowledges in a participatory capacity. The more we asked our community partners to detail important relationships or features within these landscapes on the map at the start of our research, the more the map changed. Stories emerged of powerful more than human beings and actors, namely local deities and spirits that intersect and interface with conservation and development politics in the kingdom. The collaborative and participatory nature of our research prioritized these voices and traditions and facilitated knowledge sharing to ensure local perspectives and effective relations within them be put on the map, not as ecological or cultural resources, as it is so often framed in conservation and development discourse, but as lived relational interdependencies of our more than human world. So although our research addresses numerous complexities at those intersections, that really lies at the core of our efforts. And for most of you here in the audience, what proceeds is self-evident and will admittedly not be adequately characterized in the time allotted. But for those unfamiliar, pre-Buddhist Bonche, historically fortified by Vajrayana Buddhism, interfaces deeply with the Bhutanese landscape. As we know, local deities and more than human spirits were brought into the fold of the Buddhist pantheon, many subdued by great masters like Guru Rinpoche. These beings occupy territory within the landscape and are often agents of change and power in mountains, forests, cliffs, lakes, springs, and frequently old-growth trees, such as the giant cypress you see here, the principal abode of a local deity. And its territory of influence and agency often extends to encompass a certain area. Offerings and libations are made to appease them, to prevent natural disasters or illness in the community, or to ensure good harvests and healthy livestock, to maintain good relations, in short. There's a wide-ranging world of local deities and spirits, but our research predominantly inquired into the agency of deities of the territory and settlement, Yula, Jida, or Neda Jida, whose territories are often described as the deity's palace or citadel of the deity, Podrong. Generally, in these areas, one is not allowed to cut trees or pollute the area physically or spiritually, and many of these areas have been thus protected from exploitation or degradation, safeguarded by local communities, and frequently considered prior to development projects, though this is something that is certainly changing and resulting in certain ontological, ecological, and cosmopolitical frictions. For greater depth and dimensionality on these complexities, I would, of course, encourage you to look at foundational scholarship on this subject, particularly by Dasho Karma Ura, Karma Phuntsho, and the remarkable work by Françoise Pomeray, Riamsara Kriyakona Nep, and of course, Elizabeth Allison. Many of the questions that I had in this context were relational and spatial questions, forcing me to contend with the technologies and methodologies that endeavor to address these complexities, namely spatial mapping technologies such as geographic information systems, or GIS. And if we are to contend with the modernity of Buddhism, as we are doing here this week, we must also contend with the technologies and structures that define the modern era and seek to learn from these technologies of visualization and ask whether they are inclusive of other cultural worlds or not, and whether or not they intrinsically assimilate other ways of knowing and being in the world, or if they create space for a world of many worlds. So I use different methods to approach these questions, and participatory mapping address these political, ecological, spatial, and ontological questions in very illuminating ways. Broadly defined, participatory mapping is used to represent the spatial knowledge of local communities, and it can take many different forms. Our research prioritized the following submethods: sketch mapping and scale mapping, through collaborative mapping and counter mapping. So in our research, we used sketch mapping to have conversations with local partners about their communities, letting the research participant decide every aspect and element of their own map that they created themselves. A group of local government officials drew this map together in Gangte, Pobjika, which is the site of the largest population of wintering black-necked cranes, as many of us know. It's also a conservation protected area and a Ramsar site. They drew significant buildings and important landscape features, the hillsides and central river. And if you zoomed into this particular map at the top, you would see the names of local deities written on the mountainside, whose hillside territories, or pojong, surround Pobjika's wetland. And just like humans' relationship with wildlife and other non-human beings, community relationships with local deities need to be cultivated, tended, and cared for through annual rituals and ceremonies, as well as the enforcement of social and communal rules, such as not cutting down trees within the deity's podrong or entering during the wrong time of year. So we use sketch mapping methods frequently, and they illuminated diverse local perspectives, relationships, and ecologies between communities and local deities. As is self-evident to many in our audience today, these sketch maps highlighted the ubiquity of local deities and spirits throughout Bhutan. In just these few sketch maps, and there are hundreds of sketch maps, there are Yula, Jida, Pola, Mola, Nepo, Gelpo, Lu, Tsen, and other deities and spirits. So sketch mapping methodologies were intentionally more free-form and self-directive than other methods. We employed alternative mapping methodologies that benefited group conversation using a printed map, a topographic map, to detail and discuss these relationalities collectively. This was a highly valuable method for understanding the territorial and spatial nature of deities and their proximity and relationality with other humans and more than human actors in conservation protected areas, allowing community members to discuss with one another their shared experiences and knowledge. And this process also encouraged cross-generational conversations, which is really important in this context because, as I'm sure many of us know, much of this knowledge is infrequently passed down to the next generation. So the process of mapping was oftentimes more illuminating than the end product, right? Because the negotiations that occurred in consultation across generations, genders, and occupations illuminated rich oral histories and complex power dynamics, more than human agencies and many worlds within worlds. So while these data maps illuminated sometimes overlooked perspectives from local community members involved in these community-based conservation programs, they remained flat, printed, two-dimensional base maps that were in some ways reflections of my own perception of what constitutes a valid representation of a landscape. Bringing them into my computer, they became inanimate coded data points that could be geo-referenced as points, pixels, and polygons in a GIS. Orange tags for place names and toponyms, yellow tags for local deities, and more than human spirits. Though valuable cultural heritage archives, these maps, like all maps, were unrepresentative of the lived phenomenological worlds of our research partners and the unseen beings that wield influence across the landscape and these regions in question. So challenging how these conservation geographies and spiritual landscapes are mapped, and indeed the very idea of what a map is, could get us closer to centering other cultural worlds in map making. What could maps look like that stretched the built-in Western cartographic rules or assumptions inherent in the satellite or topographic base map? So Gyampo Wangchuk and I worked together to paint a series of first-person landscape-oriented maps, paintings, drawing on traditions of Tanka and debris to foreground the worlds of local deities in these communities. Importantly, traditional art forms in the Himalayan cultural diaspora and in Vajrayana Buddhism in particular have long explored the power of visualization in representing landscapes and the six realms of rebirth and existence, manifesting relational ontologies through ritualistic art. So our efforts acknowledge this living tradition and bring it into conversation with conservation practitioners, decision makers, and partnering agencies. With just a few minutes left, let me just briefly explain and describe how we went about creating these visualizations, a corner of which you see here. And if I could ask your kind participation to refrain from taking photos during the last section of this, as well as the painting at the end. I know we all have phones and computers in our pockets, but that would be respectful, and we would appreciate that. So in just one of a dozen partnering communities, there were hundreds of local deities and more than human spirits, some known by name, others known by their podrong or biogeographical markers. And so in those maps, participants often highlighted the most powerful and significant deities found in wider community annual rituals, and they're gestured to them by name during our mapping series, indicated here in those blue circles, surrounding the Central Valley and Conservation Protected Area and site of long-term conservation initiatives for cranes. So here's a 3D version of that same map, brought into a GIS, limited as it may be, to sort of bring out the topography of an otherwise 2D map. And so from here, we've projected those stories and relational toponyms onto the canvas, drawing from our ethnographic data, collaborative mapping sessions, and consultation with dozens of Sirkinpecha and Buddhist authorities, creating a painted map that was geographically and topographically represented down to every river valley, every old-growth forest, slope, and aspect of every hillside. So the result being a data map that could be rendered in a limiting ontology of a geographic information system made animate as a painted map, informed by Vajrayana Buddhism, that highlights places of conservation significance alongside protective local deities in their podrong, illuminating these complex more than human agencies within these focal landscapes. With guidance from the Ministry of the Ministry of Home and Cultural Affairs and Department of Culture in Bhutan, we are completing a series of 5 paintings corresponding to conservation protected areas for black-necked cranes. A few of them you see here. With this project comes 1,000 different choices and contradictions, issues of ontological fixing in time and space of more than human beings, institutional power dynamics, and knowledge privileging. I nod to a long history of Bhutan scholars navigating these complexities here today. In our small way, we're asking how mapping otherwise can recenter the possibility of the multiplicity of worlds and the diversity of community environmental relationships within them. We aim to center Bhutanese traditions and worlds of knowing and ask how landscapes are conceptualized and rendered visible, not only through maps, but through traditional art, religious practice, ritual propitiations, and the preservation and use of ritual circumtexts that richly depict and in essence map the relational worlds of local deities and their environmental corollaries. Ultimately, we suggest that the limiting ontologies of Western cartographic traditions, particularly as they exist in the conservation and development sector, are insufficient for respecting and representing the living legacies of Vajrayana Buddhism and the territorial worlds of local deities and spirits that are more relational and fluid than points, polygons, and pixels can possibly depict, prompting alternative methodologies which endeavor to push both disciplinary and epistemic boundaries. And with that, I would like to invite the humble genius himself to show the first painting in this series, Mr. Gyampo Wangchuk. And again, we would just appreciate your not taking photos. Thank you. Also, you're welcome after the session to come and ask any questions of Gyampo or Pema Gyaltsen, who worked on the map as well. And again, just perhaps refrain from taking photos, but ask any questions you want, and feel free to look at the really exquisite details. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All inspiring. Thank you so much.